The morning Delores Vance walked into Hargrove and Sutton Commercial Realty. She was wearing a jacket that had seen better days, and carrying a folder held together with a rubber band. That detail matters. Remember it. Because 14 months later, that same woman would be sitting at the head of a conference table in a building that bore her name, while the man who laughed her out of his office was clearing his desk on the floor below. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Delores Vance had spent 31 years doing what most people never do. She had actually read the fine print. She'd worked as a paralegal for a property law firm in Shreveport, Louisiana, starting at 22, fresh out of a community college with a certificate and a bus pass. She learned title law the way you learn a language when you move to a foreign country. By necessity, by humiliation, and eventually, by mastery. She read deeds the way other people read novels. She could spot a clouded title from across a conference room. She knew easement law, mineral rights, adverse possession, the whole architecture of land ownership that most people never think about until something goes wrong. And in Clover County, Alabama, a lot had gone wrong for a lot of people who looked like Delores. She'd seen it. Families who'd owned land for generations, black families who'd farmed and built, and buried their people on the same soil their great-grandparents worked, suddenly facing eviction notices, partition lawsuits, heirs' properties disputes that were less about law and more about leverage. She'd spent 20 years helping lawyers untangle those cases. She knew every trick in the book because she'd watched those tricks get used. When she retired from the firm at 53, she did not take up gardening. She took up real estate, not buying houses to flip, not weekend seminars with smiling men in polo shirts. She started buying land, quietly, patiently. The way you do when you've spent 3 decades watching other people underestimate what land is actually worth. She bought a 40-acre parcel in Clover County for back taxes in 2019, $4,200. She bought a narrow strip of industrial-zoned land along Route 9 for $11,000. From an estate sale, nobody else had noticed. She bought a derelict farmstead outside of Millhaven for $28,000 when the heirs couldn't agree and just wanted it gone. By the time she walked into Hargrove and Sutton, Delores had quietly assembled 340 acres across 3 counties, debt-free, title-clear, and positioned right along a corridor that 3 different logistics companies were quietly circling. She knew what she had. She needed a commercial broker who could facilitate the deal. What she got instead was Clifton Sutton. Now, if you've ever walked into a room and felt the exact moment someone decided you didn't belong there, you know what Delores felt when Clifton Sutton looked up from his desk. He didn't stand. That was the first thing. He glanced at her jacket, at the rubber-banded folder, at the way she'd arrived without an appointment. And his entire face performed a calculation that took about half a second and arrived at a conclusion that had nothing to do with her actual business. Can I help you? The kind of, can I help you, that means the opposite. Delores told him she was interested in discussing a commercial land transaction. She said she had assembled a portfolio of parcels along the Route 9 corridor and believed she had a buyer relationship she wanted to develop through a licensed broker. Clifton Sutton leaned back in his chair. He had the look of a man who had been mildly successful for long enough that he had confused comfort with intelligence. How many acres are we talking about? 340. Something moved behind his eyes, not respect, not yet. Something more like suspicion recalibrating itself. And you own these parcels outright. Clear title on all of them. Any liens? None. He looked at the folder. You have documentation? I do. He did not reach for it. Look, I appreciate you coming in, but our firm typically works with. We have an established client base, and our minimum transaction threshold for commercial land is, it's significant. We don't really take on individual sellers who aren't already in our network. Delores looked at him. She had sat across from men like Clifton Sutton for 30 years. She had watched them undervalue, overlook, and steamroll people who didn't fit their picture of what a landowner looked like. She said, "What's your minimum threshold?" He named a number. Delores opened her folder, slid a single sheet across his desk, and waited. The sheet was a summary appraisal. 3 parcels, conservative estimates, the Route 9 strip alone, valued at 4 times what she'd paid for all 340 acres combined. Clifton Sutton looked at it for longer than he meant to. Then he pushed it back. "I think you'd be better served by a smaller firm," he said. "Someone more set up to handle." That was the sentence. This kind of thing. He didn't specify what kind. He didn't have to. Delores picked up her folder, put the rubber band back around it, and stood up. She said, "I appreciate your time," because she had been raised right, and because she already knew something Clifton Sutton did not. She had a meeting at a competing firm across town in 45 minutes. And she had already spoken to a logistics company whose acquisition director had been very, very interested in what she had assembled along that corridor. She just wanted to give Hargrove and Sutton first right of refusal. Out of courtesy, she walked out. The receptionist didn't look up. Now, here's what Clifton Sutton did not know, and what we're going to talk about. Because this is the part that matters, the part that should make every one of you watching this think about how you treat the person who walks through your door without an appointment. Delores had not come to Hargrove and Sutton by accident. She had come because 8 years earlier, a woman named Jessamine Okafor, a retired schoolteacher and Delores' oldest friend, had lost 80 acres of her family's land to a predatory partition lawsuit. The land had been in the Okafor family since 1934. The lawsuit had been facilitated quietly by a developer who had a relationship with a broker who had helped identify heirs' properties with unclear documentation. That broker's firm was Hargrove and Sutton. Delores had spent 4 years building her portfolio. She had spent 2 of those years also documenting what had happened to Jessamine's family, to 3 other families in Clover County, to a total of 7 properties that had been stripped through the same pattern of partition actions, tax default, exploitation, and title manipulation. She had a file, not a rubber-banded folder file, a file. The kind with exhibits, recorded deeds, corporate filings, LLC structures, wire transfer records, that a very patient and very thorough paralegal had known exactly how to find. She had given copies of that file to the Alabama Attorney General's office 6 weeks before she walked into Hargrove and Sutton. She had also given a copy to an investigative journalist at the Birmingham paper. And she had given a copy to the legal team at a national land rights advocacy organization that had been looking for exactly this kind of documented case to take to federal court. When Clifton Sutton pushed her appraisal summary back across his desk and said this kind of thing, he was dismissing the woman who was already holding the pin of a grenade he didn't know was in the room. The article ran on a Tuesday. It was not buried. It was not a small item. It was a long-form investigation, front page of the business section, with maps, with names, with a detailed reconstruction of how 7 black families in Clover County had lost a combined 620 acres over a period of 12 years, through a scheme that the reporter described as legal in execution and predatory in intent. Hargrove and Sutton were named. Clifton Sutton was named. 2 other brokers were named. An LLC tied to a developer named Preston were named. And if you know anything about Alabama land law, you know that when the Attorney General's office and the Federal Housing Agency start comparing notes on the same set of LLCs, things move quickly. Delores' name was not in the article. She had asked for that. She wasn't interested in being a story. She was interested in getting it right. The phone calls started almost immediately. Not to Delores, but to the firm. And then to the state licensing board. And then, on a Thursday morning that Clifton Sutton would later describe as the worst of his professional life, agents from the state attorney general's office arrived at the Hargrove and Sutton office with a civil investigative demand and a list of documents they needed to see. The receptionist who hadn't looked up when Delores left had to sign for it. Meanwhile, Delores was having a different kind of Thursday. She had closed on the Route 9 deal 2 weeks earlier. Not through Hargrove and Sutton, obviously, but through a commercial firm in Montgomery, whose principal broker was a woman named Adrienne, who had taken one look at Delores' portfolio and said, Where have you been all my life?" The logistics company had paid significantly more than the conservative appraisal. They needed the Route 9 strip for a regional distribution hub, and they had needed it clean and clear with unambiguous title, which was exactly what Delores had spent years making sure she could deliver. She used a portion of the proceeds to fund a legal challenge that returned Jessamine Okafor's family 60 of their original 80 acres. Not everything, but more than anyone had thought possible. She established a small fund at a local community development organization to help other families in similar situations get proper title documentation. She also bought the vacant commercial building on the corner of Redbud and 5th in downtown Millhaven, the one that had sat empty for 7 years because nobody could untangle the ownership dispute. She untangled it. Of course she did. She put a land rights legal clinic in it. Now I want to stop here for a moment, because I know some of you are watching this and thinking about people you know. Maybe a parent or a grandparent who had land that got taken. Maybe a family situation you're in right now where something doesn't feel right. If that's you, I want you to know. Document everything. Write down every conversation with dates and names. Record what you're legally allowed to record. Get a title search done by someone you trust. Because Delores Vance wasn't magic, she was prepared. She spent years learning exactly how the system worked so she could use it, and when the time came, she was ready. If this story means something to you, hit that like button. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them. These stories need to travel. 3 months after the article ran, there was a meeting. It was held in a conference room on the 7th floor of a building in Montgomery, a building that housed a federal housing advocacy organization that Delores had been quietly working with for 2 years. At the table were representatives from the Attorney General's office, 2 federal housing investigators, legal counsel for 4 of the affected families, and Jessamine Okafor herself, who had driven 3 hours from Clover County and was wearing her good dress. Delores was at the head of the table. Not because anyone had put her there, because she arrived early, and that was the seat with the best view of the room. And 30 years of conference rooms had taught her that you always take the seat with the best view. The meeting was about a proposed consent decree that would require Hargrove and Sutton to cooperate with the investigation, provide restitution to the affected families, and submit to a compliance monitor for 5 years. It was also effectively the end of Clifton Sutton's career as a licensed broker. He had, the week before, retained a defense attorney and issued a statement through that attorney, expressing his full cooperation with investigators and his deep regret for any harm that may have resulted from practices at his firm. The statement did not mention Delores. It did not mention the folder with the rubber band. It did not mention the appraisal summary he had pushed back across his desk. But the lead attorney for the families, a woman named Camille, who had been doing civil rights property law for 22 years, and who moved through a room like she was late for something, had read that statement and found it, in her words, the most expensive piece of paper that man will ever regret not reading more carefully. There is something that happens in a room when the real shape of a situation becomes clear to everyone at the same time. It's not loud. It's actually very quiet. It's the moment when all the assumptions that people brought in with them turn out to be wrong, and everyone has to recalibrate in real time. That's what happened in that conference room when the federal investigator laid out the timeline. The families had started losing land in 2011. The documentation Delores had assembled covered the entire period. The LLC structures were clear. The pattern was undeniable. The investigator said, "We've been looking for a case like this for 4 years. We didn't find it. It found us." Jessamine Okafor, who had been silent through most of the meeting, said, "It didn't find you. Delores built it." The room was quiet for a moment. Then the lead attorney from the AG's office said, "Mrs. Vance, I have to ask, how long did it take you to put this together?" Delores thought about the 40-acre parcel and the back taxes. The estate sale nobody noticed. The rubber-banded folder. The 31 years of reading fine print. She said, "Depends on when you start counting." The building on Redbud and 5th opened its doors on a Wednesday morning in March. It was not a grand opening. Delores didn't do grand openings. There was coffee. There were folding tables. There was a banner that someone had printed at the office supply store that said, "Clover Sancti Land Rights Clinic" in blue and gold. There was a line of people out the door before 9 a.m. An elderly man named August Beaumont, 74 years old, had driven 40 minutes with a shoebox full of papers that he'd been carrying around for 11 years, because he didn't know what to do with them and didn't know who to trust. He sat down across from a young law student named Franklin who was volunteering his Saturday, and by noon they had identified a legitimate claim to 30 acres of land that August's family had lost in a tax default proceeding back in 2013. August Beaumont did not cry in the clinic. He held it together. He thanked Franklin. He thanked the woman at the door. He walked to his truck. He cried in his truck for about 10 minutes. Then he drove home to call his daughter. Delores was not there for that. She was at a different meeting, a quiet lunch with Adrian, and a representative from a national land trust who was interested in what they were doing in Clover County and whether it could be replicated. Delores thought it could. She had a folder, a new one, no rubber band this time, a proper one, organized, tabbed with sections. She set it on the table. Across town, in an office that was significantly less comfortable than it had been 6 months prior, Clifton Sutton was meeting with his attorney to discuss the terms of a licensing agreement that would, in practical terms, end his ability to broker commercial real estate in the state of Alabama. He would later say, in a deposition, that he had not fully understood the nature of what he was declining that afternoon when a woman came in with a rubber-banded folder. The attorney had to advise him not to answer any follow-up questions on that point. There is a photograph, not widely circulated, just a photo on a phone that a volunteer took without really thinking about it, of Delores standing at the window of the clinic on Redbud and 5th, looking out at the street. She's not posing. She's just standing there, coffee cup in hand, looking out at a corner that had been empty for 7 years. She doesn't look triumphant. She doesn't look like someone who won. She looks like someone who knew exactly what the work was, and did it, and is already thinking about what comes next. That's the thing about people who have been reading the fine print for 30 years. They're never really surprised when the truth turns out to be exactly what the documents said it was. They just have to wait for everyone else to catch up. And Delores Vance had always been a patient woman.